Thank you for this opportunity to speak at the Rebuilding Nations conference. We've all been through a difficult period in the past months with the COVID crisis, suffered the deepest recession on record. Now we're looking to rebuilding in OECD countries, rebuilding to have stronger growth and bring back government deficits to more sustainable levels. And I thought that in terms of things that New Zealand should focus on in this rebuilding phase, we should focus on overcoming New Zealand's productivity problem and housing affordability, which is weak. So without further ado, I'll turn to the first of those topics, which is about increasing productivity. A long-standing issue for New Zealand is low productivity performance. So when we're thinking about policies to recover, we need to think about increasing productivity. So if we look, first of all, where does New Zealand stand in terms of its level of income per capita? And you can see there, it's the zero there corresponds to the median country in the upper half of OECD countries by income per capita. So New Zealand's about, just over 20% below the median of the upper half of OECD countries. This is all explained, more than explained, by weak labour productivity, which is almost 40% below the median for the upper half of OECD countries. And so the counterpart to why New Zealand's GDP per capita is not lower is because New Zealand does very well in terms of having people having high employment rate, of putting labour to work. And that's things like, in particular, a big influence there is that New Zealanders don't retire effectively as they retire a lot later than a lot of people do in other countries. So now if we look at labour productivity growth in New Zealand in since the mid-90s, it's been well below the OECD average, and that's actually that's a bit disappointing, really, given that New Zealand has had massively reformed its economy before this period, 1995, and at the beginning of this period, and normally a country that starts off with a relatively low level of labour productivity normally that's a factor that contributes to rapid productivity growth afterwards, because there's a possibility to catch up by imitating the productivity leaders. In the case of, in any case, in New Zealand, the labour productivity growth has been less than 1% over this period. Here we can see the level of gross fixed non-residential capital formation, so fixed investment that's not in housing, and it's related to the labour force. And we see that New Zealand has been really quite low for a long period here. So one of the things that, even though investment mightn't be so low, the fact is New Zealand has very high growth in the labour force. So you need a high amount of investment in order to keep the capital labour ratio growing. So that's a factor that's contributing to this low level of investment per person in the labour force. Why is investment low? Well, factors that contribute to that are the high cost of capital in New Zealand. So we are a nation that invests more than it saves. That's reflected in current account deficits. Since we're reliant on foreign capital to finance investment, at the margin, we end up having relatively high interest rates it's more risky for foreigners to invest in New Zealand. They have exchange rate risk, amongst other things, than investing in their home markets. New Zealand has thin venture capital, stock and bond markets. So that's... Now turning to infrastructure, we see the perceived quality of the overall infrastructure in New Zealand is relatively low by international comparison, as is the net amount of the investment in road infrastructure. So we have recommended in the past that one of the things to have a bit of performance in this regard would be to implement infrastructure demand management strategies, so to use the infrastructure more efficiently. So for example, to introduce congestion charging, and so that would to manage the demand for roading. And then we come to this again, but to diversify revenue sources for infrastructure financing, so that it's possible to finance more infrastructure where that's valuable investment. Now, another issue that we've touched on as well in recent surveys is that New Zealand has relatively high skills mismatches. Now, what are we talking about here with skills? These are the skills as measured by the PIAC studies, which are information processing skills. You know, when people are mismatched for the job they do, the skills that are normally required for the job that they do, that means they're overskilled or they're underskilled for that job. And so that has a negative effect on productivity. And so here we have a study that we quoted that was done at the OECD, found that New Zealand had relatively large potential gains from reducing skills mismatch. So how do you do that? Well, actually, when the study looked at the different factors, the most important one in New Zealand was housing supply restrictions, to ease housing supply restrictions. The problem is when you have the situation New Zealand has had is that housing supply is not very responsive to demand, and that makes the cost of housing in places that have a lot of more highly productive jobs, like in Auckland or Wellington, it makes it difficult for people to move there. And so that's why you end up getting this negative productivity effect. So now there are other reasons why New Zealand, it's well known that New Zealand is not very well integrated in global value chains. So this is under the heading of international connectedness. New Zealand is not very strong on this, and it's largely to do with its location. It's far from major markets. So then we see here, this is a figure that shows the exports relative to GDP for smaller countries, which were defined as having a population of less than 30 million. And again, we see New Zealand has very low export intensity for a small country. So this weak international connectedness, it reduces New Zealand's ability to benefit from global frontier innovation. And so one thing that New Zealand could do is it should aim to increase foreign direct investment, and for that there needs to be narrowing of the screening in the Overseas Investment Commission and reduced compliance costs and greater predictability for investors. As you probably all remember, the political decisions to intervene in some big investments in the past were like Auckland Airport, had a very bad effect on foreign investor confidence. We also had a look at doing a comparison of the productivity gap with Australia. What we saw there was by sector, the greatest contribution to the productivity gap to Australia were the two sectors. Construction was the biggest productivity gap, and financial services was the second biggest. Many studies have found that effectively the construction industry lags in productivity with respect to Australia. And so in relation to that, we suggested that the Commerce Commission should, now that it has the power to conduct market studies, should conduct one on the construction industry. There is a problem with this contributes as well with the construction industry productivity, and it contributes to the high cost of housing in New Zealand. So turning to housing, New Zealand has had a phenomenal increase in house prices relative to disposable incomes. You can see that we've highlighted Australia and Canada here as well as the OECD. You see for the OECD, house prices relative to incomes have not rocketed at all like in New Zealand. They have gone up, but of course what Australia, Canada and New Zealand have in common is very high levels of immigration. That's potentially positive for productivity. It permits agglomeration effects. It provides the skills because it's focused on selecting skilled immigrants. But what you need if you have high levels of population growth like that is to have a responsive housing supply so that you don't get it, because the immigrants tend to go to the cities where the high skilled jobs are proposed. So you really need to complement those policies with increased housing supply responsiveness to demand. We see here expenditure on housing and maintenance is extremely high in New Zealand, the highest in the OECD. The effects on the people in the lowest income quintile are quite dramatic. So we have there, more than 50% are spending more than 40% of their income on rent, which is the highest amongst OECD countries with data. So the low-income people in New Zealand are really hard hit by this high cost of housing. And, by the way, as we've seen, and it's well known in New Zealand, because the price of land is so high, it hasn't been attractive for developers to develop low-cost housing. It's to make it economic when you have to pay so much for the land, they put in high-cost housing. So here we see this is just another demonstration of the way that housing supply has failed to expand to meet demand. We see here the problem in New Zealand has been in Auckland, where the number of people per dwelling has gone up substantially, is a lot higher than we see in Australia or the rest of New Zealand. So well on people who are living rough or in emergency or homeless accommodation, or relative to the other countries with data, that's quite high. And New Zealand has a small social housing stock by international comparison as well. So just to wrap up, we had the recent national policy statement on urban development is a very positive move for easing urban containment policies and making housing supply more elastic, as they say, in relation to demand. The issue is still, though, one of the things, so there's been regulation, containment policies that have held back housing supply in areas with high demand. But the other issue has been how you finance the infrastructure that's needed to service increased housing supply. In this regard, we've recommended increasing user charging for water and roads and removing barriers to greater use of targeted rates in order to try and claw back some of the property value increases from changes in land use regulation or from infrastructure investment. And another interesting development could be to use targeted rates to pay for project-specific infrastructure loans. So that could be ways of easing the financing constraints that local bodies face in order to increase the housing supply and make them less adverse to growth. So, I mean, another issue here is also, whether local housing more generally, local bodies should share more generally in some tax base that's linked to growth. I mean, so we still have to move forward on breaking giving them incentives to have growth instead of the current situation where they have incentives that are opposed to growth, financial incentives. Another development recently has been the establishment of the National Housing and Urban Development Authority, which actually, again, should be a positive development for assisting with land amalgamation in specific areas, which should make it possible to do projects for sort of more intense housing development that are actually more sensible, rather than when you can just buy individual sections and with houses in between. I mean, you can't do a big townhouse development, for example. So that's a positive development. And then we argued for a refocusing of ReBuilding in the last survey to be away from selling houses to first-time buyers towards supplying land through aggregating fragmented land holdings and de-risking development sites. So that comes to the last point, which is that New Zealand does need to increase social housing provision in areas with shortages. So we had, including through expanding partnerships with non-governmental organisations and reallocating funding from ReBuild. So I think in the recovery from this COVID, about measures that will contribute to increasing New Zealand's productivity and making housing more affordable, I think that would be very good for New Zealanders' future well-being. Thank you.